In 1953, in a room dug out underneath a 7-story boulder in the Mojave Desert, a man sat down with about 30 people and went into a trance every Friday night for years. And while he was under, something spoke through him. Not to him, through him. He didn't remember any of it afterward. The people sitting around him wrote it down by hand. 2 years later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation opened a file on him, and they kept it open until the day he died. His name was George Van Tassel. I want to show you what those transcripts actually say and what happened to the pages. Landers, California, 1947. A 37-year-old man walks away from a career in aviation and moves his wife and 3 children into the desert. He worked at Douglas Aircraft until 1941, then for Howard Hughes, then he finished at Lockheed. Good work, steady work, the kind of job a man in 1947 held on to. He leased an abandoned airstrip from the Bureau of Land Management, out past Joshua Tree, and he took his family to live next to a rock, not near a town, next to a rock. 7 stories of granite, sitting alone in open desert with nothing around it for miles. He opened a small cafe, ran the airstrip, and started a dude ranch. And underneath that boulder there were rooms, already dug, already finished, with a ceiling and a floor. Van Tassel didn't dig them. He knew exactly who did, because he'd known the man for 17 years. The man who dug the rooms was called Frank Kritzer. Van Tassel met him in 1930 at his uncle's auto repair shop in Santa Monica, where he was pumping gas. Kritzer was broke, his car was dying, and he was talking about a mine he was working somewhere out in the Morongo Basin. Van Tassel helped him get moving again, and Kritzer went out to the desert and never really came back. He picked the boulder and he dug in underneath it. He built himself a home in the ground, ran a small airstrip, and put up a radio antenna out there in the middle of nothing. Kritzer was born in the United States, and he was an American citizen. But he had a German name, he lived alone in an empty place, he had an airstrip, and he had a radio. In 1942, with the country at war with Germany, that was enough. People started saying he was a spy. The police came out to Giant Rock to question him. What happened next is still argued about, and the versions don't agree on who moved first. What isn't argued about is the result. During the siege, Frank Kritzer set off dynamite and killed himself underneath the rock. After he died, Van Tassel applied for the lease on the land. So the room where the Friday night sessions happened, the room where 30 people would sit in the dark and take notes, was a hole a suspected spy had dug with his own hands and then died in. Nobody at those meetings thought that was strange enough to mention. They started in 1953 and they ran on Fridays. Between 25 and 45 people came each time. They drove out from Los Angeles, from Riverside, from towns that barely existed, parked next to the rock, and climbed down into Kritzer's old rooms. There was no stage, no lecture. They sat and they went quiet and they waited. Think about what that room actually was. You're underground, in the dark, in a space a dead man carved out of decomposed granite by hand. The desert outside drops close to freezing after sunset in winter, and the ground holds the cold. So people came in coats. There was no electricity out there for years, which means lamplight. And lamplight means the only thing anybody could see clearly was whoever was nearest to them. Somebody always brought paper. That was the arrangement, and it was understood before anyone sat down. Van Tassel described it as attunement, not as anything supernatural. His position, stated in his own writing, was that this was a technique, something anyone could be trained to do, and not a spiritual gift. He was insistent about that for the rest of his life. Then he'd go under. His voice would change. He'd speak in full sentences, with vocabulary and syntax that the people in the room said didn't sound like him. And when he came out of it, he had no idea what he said. He had to be told. That's why the notes existed in the first place. And it's why they were taken so carefully. He wasn't recording his own ideas. He was being read back to himself. Which is where this stops being one man's word against everybody's. Because there were dozens of people in that room over the years. And a lot of them had never met before they got there. The transcripts start before the underground sessions do. On July 18th, 1952, Van Tassel wrote down a message he said arrived while he was alone. It came in two parts. First, an entity called Portla, announcing that a craft was approaching the solar system with a commanding officer aboard. Then the officer introduced himself, and the introduction is the single most quoted line in the whole contactee era. He gave his name as, quote, Ashtar, Commandant Quadra Sector, Patrol Station Share. Now hold that date, July 18th, 1952. It matters later. What came through after the introduction wasn't about spacecraft or technology or the visitors themselves. It was about one specific thing, and it stayed about that one thing for months, the hydrogen bomb. The messages told Van Tassel that detonating the hydrogen atom would extinguish life on the planet. Not damage it, end it. He was told hydrogen was a living substance, that exploding it would alter the atmosphere in a way that couldn't be undone, and that he should go and speak to physicists about it. And then he was given an instruction. And the instruction is the part that changes how you hear all of this. He was told to take it to the United States government, not to publish it, not to preach it, to contact the government directly, tell them to reach every nation regardless of politics, and get the test stopped. A few weeks later, on August 3rd, another message came through addressed specifically to government intelligence operations, dismissing any attempt to trap or force down one of their craft. Then on August 15th, and again on the 24th, the subject narrowed even further. Hydrogen, the transcripts say, is a living substance. Detonating it wouldn't just release energy, it would change the composition of the atmosphere in a way that couldn't be walked back, and the correct response was to go and ask a physicist. That's the instruction. Not pray, not prepare, not hide. Ask someone who does this for a living, and then act on what he tells you. There's something worth noticing in that, and it's easy to miss under all the science fiction vocabulary. Every single message in 1950, 2 points in the same direction, which is toward institutions, toward Washington, toward physicists, toward other countries. Whatever was coming through that man, it kept telling him to go and talk to people with actual authority, and he kept doing it. A man in a desert cafe was writing letters to Washington on behalf of a voice that used his mouth while he was unconscious. I'll say the obvious thing here, because you're already thinking it. The 1950s were full of men exactly like this. The contactee era produced dozens of them, and most of them followed the same arc, which was a vision, then a book, then a lecture tour, then a bank account. Van Tassel fits that shape almost perfectly. He published a booklet called I Rode a Flying Saucer in 1952, the same year as the first message. He founded an organization. He solicited donations through a newsletter. That is not a defense. That's the case against him. And it's a strong one. So the question isn't whether he had a motive. He had one. The question is why he kept going for 26 years and why the thing he spent that money on made him nothing. On March 13th, 1953, the transcripts record a set of messages instructing 3 of the command substations to intervene in the war in Korea. The Korean armistice was signed on July 27th, 1953, 4 months and 14 days later. I want to be careful with this because it's the exact place where this kind of story usually falls apart. I'm not telling you a transcript ended a war. Korea ended because of 2 years of negotiation at Panmunjom, a change of government in Washington, and the death of Stalin in March of that year. There is a complete, documented, entirely human explanation for the timing, and it doesn't need a single word of Van Tassel's. Here's the part that's harder to put down. The transcript is dated. It was read out loud in a room, and the people who wrote it down that night were still alive and still telling the same story 40 years later. Which brings us back to the pages, because everything I've told you so far exists because somebody in that room had a pencil. 5 months after the Korea transcript, the story stops being about voices. On the night of August 24th, 1953, Van Tassel was sleeping outdoors near the rock. That was normal out there in August. The rooms underneath held the heat and the open desert didn't, so people slept outside. His wife was asleep next to him. At around 2 a.m, he said, a man woke him up. The man gave his name as Soganda. He was wearing a one-piece gray suit. He spoke fluent English with no accent, and he said he'd come from Venus. He looked, by Van Tassel's own description in a televised interview 11 years later, like an ordinary healthy man in his late 20s. Then he said he was 700 years old. There was a craft sitting on the airstrip, the same strip Van Tassel had been leasing since '47, hovering about 8 feet off the ground, 36 feet across, 19 feet high. Van Tassel said he was taken aboard, that 3 more of them were waiting inside, and that they showed him the navigation instruments and the seating, all of it explained without anybody speaking. He put the whole thing at about 20 minutes, and before he was put back on the ground, he said, they gave him a formula. That's the part that matters, because it's the hinge the rest of his life turns on. Everything he built after 1953, he built because of what he said happened in those 20 minutes. He wrote it up in a book in 1956 called Into This World and Out Again, and he never changed the account. Except he did change one thing, and it's the detail that should bother you. Ask what the formula actually was. Van Tassel gave 2 different answers over the years. Sometimes he said it was a 17-page equation that had been secretly tested in Chicago. Other times he'd give you the short version, which was F equals 1 over T, frequency equals 1 over time. That's not an alien formula. That's the definition of frequency. It's in the first chapter of any physics textbook. It was in every physics textbook in 1953, and a man who'd spent 15 years inside aircraft companies would have seen it 1,000 times. So either the visitors from Venus flew here to hand a mechanic something a high school student already knows, or he was filling a gap in his own story with the nearest piece of real science he had. And I don't think there's a comfortable third option. Hold on to one more thing before we move on. His wife was lying beside him that night. In 1954, the FBI opened a file on him. The reason wasn't the messages. Washington was not investigating a man for talking in his sleep. According to the Bureau's own material, 2 things put him on the list. The first was his old association with Frank Kritzer, the neighbor who'd been suspected of spying for Germany and who died under the rock. The second was the machine. By 1954, Van Tassel had started describing a structure he intended to build out of the messages he received, and Bureau sources raised the possibility that whatever he was assembling out in the desert could be a weapon. They watched him, on and off, into the 1960s. An agent sat in the audience at Phipps Auditorium in Denver in 1960 and filed a report noting that most of the lecture was spent explaining events in the Bible as the work of space people. A document dated April 12th, 1965, describes him as an eccentric, self-ordained minister of a quasi-religious organization. 24 years of federal attention paid to a man running a cafe next to a rock. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribing costs you nothing, and it's the only thing that keeps a channel like this in front of people who'd actually watch it. By 1959, he wasn't a man in the desert anymore. He was an institution. The Giant Rock Spacecraft Convention ran once a year, every year, from 1953 until he died. People drove out. Some of them flew out and landed on his airstrip. According to the Integratron's own published history, the 1959 convention drew around 11,000 people into open desert with no water, no shade, and no facilities, because a man was going to talk to them about the Space Brothers. Every well-known contactee of the period turned up at those conventions at some point, and the roster is worth hearing, because these weren't professors. Truman Bethurem laid asphalt for a living. He said he fell asleep in his truck on a night shift in the Nevada desert and woke up surrounded by people, and that their captain was a woman named Aura Raines from a planet called Clarion. He wrote it down in 1954. His wife left him over it. Daniel Fry was a technician at a rocket testing range. Howard Menger ran a sign painting business in New Jersey. Working men, one after another, all telling the same shape of story in the same decade, and all of them ending up in the same patch of desert once a year to say it out loud in front of a crowd. George Adamski, the most famous of all of them, is usually described as boycotting Giant Rock, and that turns out to be wrong. Adamski came once in 1955 and gave a 35-minute lecture, and while he was there, he sat for an interview with Edward J. Ruppelt had run Project Blue Book. He was the Air Force officer who coined the term unidentified flying object, and he'd go on to write the most quoted skeptical book of that entire generation. He was standing in the tent. The government's own former investigator went out to Giant Rock in the middle of the conventions and took notes. Here's the part I keep coming back to. Van Tassel described his aviation career in a specific way. He said he worked as a flight safety inspector. He said he'd been a test pilot for Howard Hughes. He held a private pilot license as a young man in Ohio, and he worked at a municipal airport near Cleveland before he ever came to California. So the aviation part was real. Researchers have questioned the rest of it for decades. They didn't have to look far because the answer is sitting in the FBI file. At one point, the Bureau sent an inspector named Joseph Sizu to gather background, and he spoke to Eva, Van Tassel's wife. She told him her husband was not a pilot. She said he held a mechanic certificate. She told the inspector he left high school 3 months short of graduating. That's not a skeptic. That's not a journalist with a column to fill. That's the woman who lived with him, sitting across from a federal agent, quietly correcting the record on the only part of his story that anybody could actually check. And remember where she was on the night of August 24th, 1953, asleep on the ground next to him, close enough to touch. At the exact hour, a man from Venus was supposedly standing over them, and a 36-foot craft was sitting on their own airstrip. She had every chance to take that apart. A federal inspector was in the room asking questions, and there is no record of her contradicting a single word of it. What she corrected was the resume, so he inflated it. A man who told a room full of people that a galactic commander used his voice was also rounding up his own resume, and the smaller lie is the one we can prove. And that should be the end of it. It usually is. Every one of these stories ends right here, with the man exposed and the audience going home. Except the man who inflates a resume to sell booklets, takes the money, and leaves. He doesn't spend the next 18 years of his life building something he was never going to charge admission for. He broke ground in 1957. The Integratron is a dome, 38 feet high, 55 feet across, standing on open desert about 3 miles from Giant Rock. 16 arched ribs of clear Douglas for hold the shape, custom fabricated, joined with wooden dowels and adhesive sheathed in plywood 3/8 of an inch thick. At the top, there's an oculus of concrete and micarta, a material Westinghouse developed for aerospace, weighing 1.5 tons. There is not one metal fastener anywhere in that building. No nails, no screws, nothing ferromagnetic in the entire structure, because he said the design wouldn't tolerate it. He said the design came from 3 places: from the writings of Nikola Tesla and Georges Lakhovsky, from the proportions of the Tabernacle of Moses, and from the visitors who he said gave him a technique for recharging human cells. That's what it was for. Not a weapon, whatever the Bureau thought. A machine to give people more time. He worked on it for 18 years, funded entirely by donations he raised through his newsletter and through hundreds of speaking engagements. The shell went up. The interior machinery never got finished because he could never raise enough at once to install it. That's the detail I sit with for a second. 18 years of driving the halls in other states, standing in front of whoever showed up, asking for money, driving home, and putting every dollar of it into a building 3 miles from a rock. He didn't buy a house with it. He didn't retire on it. The convention that brought 11,000 people into the desert existed to pay for the dome. And when the money ran short, which it did constantly, the work stopped and he went out and gave more talks. A man does that for one of 2 reasons. Either he's the most patient, confidence artist in the history of the state of California, or he believed it. On February 9th, 1978, George Van Tassel had a heart attack in Santa Ana, California. He was visiting friends and getting a publication printed. He was 67 years old. The opening was a few weeks away. The machine inside was still incomplete. His epitaph reads, "Birth through induction, death through short circuit." Now the part that stops me. Within days of his death, his electronic equipment, his notes and his diagrams were gone from the property, according to the Integratron's own timeline, published by the people who own the building today. None of it has surfaced since. Not sold at auction. Not donated to a university. Not sitting in a box in a relative's garage. Gone from a fenced property in open desert where nothing arrives or leaves by accident. Parts of his FBI file are still blacked out. The buildings at Giant Rock stood empty after that, got broken into and stripped. And eventually the Bureau of Land Management decided the only thing left to do was bulldoze what was there. The cafe is gone. The airstrip is gone. Kritzer's rooms are gone. The dome survived all of it. In April of 2018, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places, and it's open to visitors. You could walk into it next week. And the question I keep returning to isn't whether anything ever spoke through George Van Tassel on those Friday nights. I don't know. I genuinely don't know, and anybody who tells you they do is selling you something he already tried to sell first. The question is what a man has to believe to give a quarter of his life and every dollar he raised to a machine he never got to switch on. He wasn't a pilot. His wife said so to the FBI, and she was right. He built it anyway.